The Assimilation of the Metis.
Hi, we are students that live, work, and play on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
In honor of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we wanted to learn more about the assimilation of the Métis people.
So who are the Metis?
We discovered that the Métis people emerged in the 1700s when freemen of fur trade companies began to establish families with indigenous women, often from the Cree or Ojibwe. Their children began to identify as a separate group known as the Métis.
Cultural assimilation is the process in which a minority group or culture comes to resemble a society's majority group.
The main way that Metis people were assimilated was by sending their youth to residential schools. The first residential schools in Canada were established to assimilate First Nations, but many Inuit and Métis ended up attending.
In all, more than 150,000 Indigenous children attended, resulting in the death of thousands.
In the 1900s, the government classified Métis children into 3 categories to decide who would go to school and where.
Basically, they were categorized based on if they lived like white people or like Indians. Métis children were too white to attend a residential school and too Indian to have an ordinary education.
Métis children also felt discriminated against by other children. To protect themselves, Métis families would hide and even deny their identity. Some were able to pass as white, while others would try to identify as Indian instead of Métis.
Significant parts of Métis attendance in residential schools were unrecorded as they would be moved from school to school. Métis children were used to fill quotas, as the school would receive more money the more children attended.
Some days the Métis children would be treated like all the other Indigenous children, but other days they would be treated completely differently. Some Métis survivors tell stories about how they weren't allowed to stay at school overnight, unlike the other First Nations children. It didn't matter if they lived far away from the school, they'd be forced to walk kilometers to and back from the school every day.
The federal government considered Métis something that was to be dealt with by the provinces. Many believe that the Métis had it significantly easier in comparison to the other Indigenous groups, but this is not true.
For example, with the Indian Act, which the government introduced in 1876, it gave the government power over the First Nations' lives. This also gave support and funding to services for health and education. However, because the Métis fell into the gray area, the provincial and federal government stated that they would not support the Métis at all.
Métis are often the forgotten part of the damage residential schools did. People go as far as to say that Métis do not have an excuse that their culture is in need of revitalization. Many residential schools where mainly Métis children attended didn't even feel the need to issue an apology.
Going to residential schools was a significant part of Métis history because for years the Métis lost more and more of their culture. Parents were unable to pass down their language, music, and stories to their children, which meant that significant parts of Métis culture were lost. The consequences of residential schools were felt throughout generations of Métis families and continue to be present today. As a cause of the change residential schools created, there is a great extent of culture revitalization needed for the Métis.
J.J. Lavallee, the Culture and Community Coordinator of the BC Métis Federation, said, "What we have to do is preserve the knowledge that we have to begin with, be that through our language, through our music, and if the future generations can know what it was like to be Métis, they can decide for themselves what it is for them, how they tie to the culture, how they tie to the land, and how they tie to the music."
When asked about how to help the cultural revitalization as an individual who is not Métis, Lavallee responded, "The revitalization of the Métis culture can be helped through literature, through discussion, through bringing in speakers, and just engagement through community and youth."
We learned that the main way Métis were assimilated was through residential schools, which stripped them of their cultural identity. Residential schools were a significant part of Métis history because they completely disrupted the communities of Métis people, which would impact their lives for generations to come. Remember to reflect and wear an orange shirt on Thursday, September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.